The farm had always been my sanctuary. Quiet, sprawling, with the faint smell of hay and fresh earth, it was my haven from the rest of the world. The rhythmic pulse of the seasons, the steady routine of caring for the horses and crops, it was a life I had come to cherish. For years, it was enough. I didn't mind the solitude. I didn't need anything more. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I had grown accustomed to the days, and in many ways, I had settled into the silence. But tonight was different. The storm came in hard and fast, and with it, the usual calm of my farm was gone. The wind howled, rain pounded the windows, and the thunder rattled the old farmhouse, shaking the very bones of the place. I couldn't remember the last time a storm had felt so fierce. I had been out in the barn, securing the horses for the night. The animals were uneasy, stomping nervously in their stalls, their hooves loud against the wooden floor. I whispered soft reassurances to them, trying to calm the restless creatures. My voice was steady, though my heart was starting to race, and I could feel the storm pressing in on me, not just outside, but in my chest as well. The last horse was finally settled, and I moved quickly toward the house, pulling my collar up against the driving rain. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, but I kept my head down, eager to get inside where it was warm. But just as I reached the porch, I heard it. A knock. I paused, brow furrowed. Who in their right mind would be out in this weather? I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a visitor, let alone one who would brave a storm like this. I stepped inside and approached the door, my boots heavy on the wooden floor. The knock came again, louder this time, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I opened the door, and for a moment, I couldn't make sense of what I saw. A man, young, probably in his late 20s. He stood there drenched, shivering violently, his clothes clinging to his thin frame. His golden hair was matted against his forehead, and his pale blue eyes seemed to shine, even in the dim light of the storm. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "Two had an accident. My car slid off the road and hit a tree. I didn't know where else to go." I stared at him for a moment, my mind racing. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen someone alone someone who looked so out of place here. But something in his eyes, something desperate and raw, tugged at me. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "You're going to freeze to death out there." He hesitated, his body shaking from the cold. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing." I cut him off. "Now get in here before you catch your death." He nodded, stepping into the warmth of the house. I closed the door behind him, the storm's roar muffled by the thick walls. "You're soaked to the bone," I said, my eyes scanning him as I moved toward the fireplace. "Take those off, and I'll get you something dry." He blinked at me, looking a little startled. "Oh, I don't want to ruin your floor." I chuckled, shaking my head. "My floor will survive. You won't if you stay in those wet clothes. Wait here." I disappeared into the hallway and returned moments later with a thick towel and a pair of flannel pajamas. I handed them to him, our fingers brushing for just a moment. It wasn't much, but the brief touch sent a jolt through me, one I couldn't ignore. "Thank you," he said softly, accepting the clothes. "There's a bathroom down the hall," I said. "You can change in there." He nodded and disappeared down the hallway. I remained in the living room, running a hand through my damp hair, trying to calm the erratic beat of my heart. The storm outside raged on, but inside, something else was stirring. I wasn't sure I was ready to face it yet. When he came back, the transformation was immediate. He was warmer, more relaxed. The oversized flannel pajamas hung on his lean frame, but somehow they seemed to suit him. "Better?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Much," he said, offering a smile. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," I replied, motioning for him to sit by the fire. "What were you doing out here in this weather?" He sank into the armchair, letting the warmth of the fire chase the chill from his body. "I was on my way to visit some friends in the next town over. Took a wrong turn, ended up on some back road. The storm hit, and before I knew it, I lost control of the car, skidded right into a tree." I nodded. "Lucky you weren't hurt." "Luckier than I feel," he said. a rueful smile tugging at his lips. By the way, I'm Ethan. Ethan Murphy. Tyler Williams, I replied, offering a small smile. Welcome to my little corner of nowhere. His smile widened, and for a moment I felt like I could breathe again. There was something about the way he looked at me, something about his presence, that made me feel like I wasn't alone in this place. Well, Tyler Williams, Ethan said, his tone light but warm, I think your little corner of nowhere just saved my life. I chuckled softly, but the sound quickly faded as my gaze lingered on him. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside I felt something shift. I wasn't sure what it was. It had been so long since I'd felt connected to anyone, let alone a complete stranger who had wandered into my life. Ethan settled back in his chair, his blue eyes glowing softly in the firelight. The crackling of the logs was the only sound in the room, but the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, something unfamiliar. So, what about you? Ethan asked, his voice breaking the quiet. What brings you all the way out here? Don't get many people traveling in these parts. I shifted in my chair, watching the flames flicker. Born and raised on this farm, I said. It's been in my family for generations. My parents retired a few years ago, passed it down to me. Been taking care of it ever since. Ethan tilted his head, intrigued. And you've been here all this time? Alone? I hesitated, my gaze dropping to the fire. Yeah, it's just me and the horses now. Not a bad life. Quiet. Steady. Lonely? Ethan added, his voice softer than before. I looked up at him, surprised by his perceptiveness. Sometimes, I admitted quietly, but it's easier this way. Less complicated. The next few days passed by in a blur. Ethan stayed on, mostly because the storm didn't seem to want to let up. I offered him a place to sleep in the guest room, but his gratitude and persistence in helping around the farm made it clear he wasn't just here to pass time. He genuinely wanted to be useful, and while I was used to doing everything myself, I couldn't deny that it was nice to have an extra set of hands. It was strange, at first, having someone else in the house after all this time, but Ethan's quiet presence seemed to fill the spaces left by years of solitude. We talked in the evenings over tea, sharing small bits of our lives. He wasn't from far away, just a few towns over, but the distance between our worlds felt vast. His life seemed different from mine, full of motion and excitement, while mine had settled into a predictable rhythm. One morning, the rain stopped, and the sun finally broke through the clouds. The earth seemed to sigh with relief, and I could feel the warmth of the day on my skin as I stepped outside to feed the horses. The ground was slick, and the air smelled fresh, like the world was starting over. Ethan was already out there, his sleeves rolled up as he shoveled hay into the feeding troughs, his back to me as he worked. I couldn't help but watch him for a moment, the way his shoulders moved under his shirt, the quiet determination in his actions. He worked with the same focus I had, but there was something almost calming in the way he moved, a contrast to the restless energy I sometimes felt inside. Morning, I called, breaking the silence. Ethan turned around, his smile as warm as ever. Morning. I thought I'd get a head start today. I nodded, walking over to join him. I appreciate it. You don't have to do all the work, you know. I don't mind, he said, his tone light. It's good for me. Gives me something to focus on. I chuckled, remembering the first night we'd met when he'd been shivering at the door, lost and helpless. I'm glad you found something to focus on then. Ethan met my gaze, his expression softening. Me too. There was something in the way he looked at me, something unspoken, but I couldn't quite place it. It wasn't a gaze of pity or even sympathy. It was something else, something I hadn't seen in a long time. I quickly turned my attention back to the horses, not wanting to think too much about it. We spent the rest of the morning working side by side, the air crisp and clear after the storm. As I worked, I found myself stealing glances at him, at the ease with which he moved, at the way the sunlight caught his hair. I pushed the thoughts aside, telling myself it was nothing. He was just someone passing through, someone I'd helped, that was all. But as the day stretched on, I started to notice more things about him. The way his laugh seemed to fill the room, how his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he always seemed to have a way with words, even when they weren't said aloud. It was as if he understood more than just the surface of things. One evening, after a long day of chores, we sat on the porch, each of us with a cup of hot cider in hand. The sun had just begun to set, casting the world in a warm golden light. It was one of those rare moments when everything seemed still, as if the world itself was waiting for something. "So," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "what's it really like living out here all alone?" I shifted in my seat, feeling the weight of the question. It wasn't something I'd talked about in years. The loneliness, the isolation. I'd made peace with it, convinced myself that it was what I wanted. But now, with him sitting beside me, the words felt heavier than I expected. "It's quiet," I said finally, my voice low. "Too quiet sometimes." Ethan glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. "I get that. I've spent plenty of time on the road by myself, and it can get overwhelming." I met his gaze, surprised by the openness in his eyes. "You seem like someone who's always on the move." He chuckled softly. "I used to be. Life was always about the next thing, the next place. But I don't know, something about being here feels different." "Different how?" I asked, though wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Ethan's eyes flickered to the horizon, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else, something that would change the air between us. But then, he shook his head, almost as if he hadn't meant to say anything at all. "I'm not sure," he said after a pause, "but I think I'm starting to find a reason to stay." His words hung in the air between us, and I felt a sharp breath catch in my throat. What was he saying? Could he be implying what I thought he was? I quickly looked away, trying to hide the sudden rush of heat that surged in my chest. I hadn't asked for this shift in the air, this strange feeling that was beginning to grow inside me. "Well, I'm glad you're sticking around," I said, my voice steady, but betraying the unease I felt. "I could use the help." Ethan's lips curled into that small, knowing smile of his. "I think you're more capable than you give yourself credit for. But it's nice to have someone to share the work with." His words felt like something more than just idle conversation, something beneath the surface. But I pushed that feeling down, focusing instead on the familiar crackling of the fire as the evening settled around us. Over the following days, we worked together, talked together, and, in small, quiet moments, I began to realize just how much Ethan had become a part of my life in such a short time. The farm didn't feel quite as empty anymore. The silence didn't feel so oppressive. And while I still didn't fully understand the change, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone anymore. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something new had come into my life, something unexpected. But no matter how hard I tried to push it away, I couldn't ignore the feeling that this was just the beginning. And maybe, just maybe, that was all I needed to know.